Big stick and dollar diplomacy. So we're going to start off with Theodore Roosevelt and big stick diplomacy. Theodore Roosevelt advocated a rather aggressive foreign policy. He believed the United States should play a very significant part in the global community. However, he did advocate the idea of speak softly but carry a big stick. So you use negotiations at first. You try to do things subtly, but if there is some threat to our interest, or if you're trying to get something done or try and negotiate a treaty or whatever, but things aren't just going as planned, if necessary, that's when you need to wield the big stick. Now, according to Roosevelt, the big stick is going to be the Navy. So he advocated putting more federal dollars to building up a world-class Navy, which is going to happen. He always believed that we needed to be prepared for any situation, and if we didn't have a military to be able to back up what we say, like for instance with the Monroe Doctrine, here we have this thing where we're saying, hey, we are the overseers of the Western Hemisphere, so stay out. But if we don't have anything to back that up, then really what does it mean? So Roosevelt wanted to build up that Navy so we were prepared and we could protect our interests as necessary. So the classic example of big stick diplomacy is going to be the acquisition of the canal zone and the building of the Panama Canal. So the video that you guys are going to watch right now is a jokes video, and he's going to be talking a little bit about Roosevelt's foreign policy and the acquisition of the Panama Canal Zone and the building of the canal itself. So again, classic example of big stick diplomacy.
In this lecture, we're going to go over the U.S. role under the administrations of Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. And this story starts with this desire to find a shortcut to Asia. If you were involved in exports in 1890s or 1900 even, and you wanted to get your goods from the east coast of the United States to the Asian market, for example, China, you were going to have to travel a very long way to make this happen.
Just sit right back and you hear a tale of a faithful.
You're going on a long journey around South America. What up to the polar bears? Pick up some peeps in Peru. Get some gas in Hawaii. And find yourself on a very long journey, eventually, apparently crashing into Southeast Asia and India. And for a very long time, people had dreamt of a shorter route. And that's where you have this desire to build a canal. Forget trade, for example. What if it was military reasons? What if there was some sort of desire to defend your territory, whether it be Hawaii or the west coast of the United States? You need to get battleships quickly from one spot to another. It would be great if you could find a way to go through a canal. That's where Panama comes into play. Panama is a beautiful, interesting country. Here's the highlights. They have beautiful rainforests with quetzal birds. They have beaches with coconuts you could just drink from the tree or from the ground. Beach huts where you could stay inside with your mosquito net, and you have beautiful islands all to yourself where you can run around butt naked and playing like, Jacques Cousteau, Tom Sawyer type stuff. Kids who battle each other with their feet. And mannequins. Moving on. All within reach with a cheap bus ride from anywhere in Central America. Now here's the story. If you can somehow imagine going from New York to San Francisco is going to take 13,000 miles back then. That is a waste of time and money. And so if you could find a way to build a canal right here in the central part of America, you can reduce that to 5,200 miles. And so this canal was envisioned by many different people, and it started with the French. And so you want to build this man-made waterway going through the continent in these areas, digging up the land and filling it with water and being able to take this shortcut. And Panama is the area where people dreamt of this dream becoming a reality. Because this area right here, if you take out the lake, 40 miles of land linking North and South America. This would eliminate the need of traveling around South America. Now here's the thing. Canals. You got to dig, you got to put these locks in place. You fill them with water. The ship goes in. The doors shut, these giant concrete doors. The water is pumped in. And as the water is pumped in about 15 minutes, it rises up. These little machines tow the boat, making sure it doesn't crash into the side of the concrete wall. And this is how the canal works. And the locks allow the boats to go up in elevation or down in elevation. So the Panama Canal had to be built. And who was going to build it? So there's the process. There's the ship. 24 hours. You could take a look. Go on YouTube. Type in Panama Canal 24-hour video. And this thing still is operational today. Now, how was it created? Well, allow me to tell you. Panama Canal.
What's up, students? You're going to learn about the Panama Canal today. So I paid $600 to get here, so you can see it. There it is. I have my $2 Panama Coke, and I probably have yellow fever, so study for your test. And I'm sweaty, pasty, white.
Got a tramp steamer, my ship's called Hal.
40 miles on the Panama Canal.
Got a cargo of sodas, they are local.
40 miles on the Panama Canal.
Sailing across the Caribbean Sea to the Pacific in a jiffy through Panama, but not on land.
The French are the first ones to attempt it. In fact, in 1879, a French company gets the rights to try to build this canal. They get permission from Colombia. Colombia actually controlled Panama, and Colombia gives a French company authority to build this canal. Now, what happens is things don't go well. They start building, they put a railroad in. The railroad's important so you can move workers and sediment and other things, supplies, heavy equipment into the area. But they start building, but there's a lot of mismanagement. They underestimated how difficult this project was going to be. They thought it would cost one amount. It cost it way more. This is a very different thing than building the canal that was in, for example, Egypt, the Suez Canal, where you're digging through sand. This is jungle. It rains a lot. It's very humid. And you got these little guys, mosquitoes. Thing about these mosquitoes, which people didn't know, was when they bite you, they are spreading diseases such as yellow fever and malaria. And after a number of years of trying to build this thing, $400 million later, the French company goes bankrupt. And basically what happens is this guy was kind of one of the early figures. If you go to Panama, his face is everywhere. Fernando Maria Visconde de Lesseps. So he's one of the pioneers of this vision. They did a lot of work, a lot of excavating, a lot of digging away of the sediments and building of the canal, but it doesn't get completed. Well, in 1901, the United States has a new president. William McKinley is assassinated by a crazy anarchist, and now Theodore Roosevelt becomes president. And he has this dream that he wants to make this thing a reality. But here's the deal. In 1901, Colombia still controls Panama. So he makes Colombia an offer.
Let's make him an offer he can't refuse.
And Colombia rejects the treaty, the Hay-Herran Treaty, Hay-Herran. Colombia rejects the treaty. They say, no, we don't want to sell this canal zone to the United States, and so be gone. We're not selling it to you. Now Roosevelt, of course, dreams are dashed. What is he going to do? He has a couple of options. He could cry. He could find a new place to build a canal. Remember, Nicaragua was an option, but there's a lot of volcanic activity there, so there were some questions about whether or not it would work. Go to war with Colombia. That could get sticky, look like a big bully defeating a smaller country. offer Colombia more money. That's always a possibility. But then again, you get into this, situation where, when does it stop? Or none of the above. Now, if you're at home and you're thinking, cry, you're wrong. There's a story, a true story, where Theodore Roosevelt was giving a speech. He was shot. He got hit by bullets, stood back up, finished the speech before getting medical attention. Crying is not an option. What Roosevelt does reminds me of my favorite line by a rapper I don't like. Real G's move in silence like lasagna. Some of you are confused. Roosevelt decides, hey, why don't I hook up with some of these French company officials? They want to get rid of this project. They want to get their money back. And what they end up doing, some members of the French company and some people of Panama say, hey, why don't we declare independence? Why don't we declare independence? And when I say we, Panama declares its independence. Roosevelt promises to support them. In fact, a lot of the planning for the independence, the writing of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the flag that's produced, is done in the United States in a hotel room in New York. In 1903, in November of 1903, Panama declares independence, and to make sure that this thing is successful, back to that quote, real G's move in silence like lasagna, Roosevelt sends a couple of U.S. ships right off the coast of Panama, kind of as a warning. Don't mess with the Panama independence movement. Roosevelt sends these warships to make sure the Panamanian Revolution is successful. He historically claims, I took the canal zone while everyone else was talking. He just does it. And this is part of his philosophy. He was a firm believer of this old African proverb, speak softly and carry a big stick, which is basically the Lil Wayne, real G's move in silence saying, don't talk a lot about it, just do it. His big stick policy. See Roosevelt there with his big stick sailing into Panama. What happens is shortly after Panama gets its independence from Colombia, which is right here, one of the reasons why Colombia is not able to really stop this independence is there's a very, very intense jungle right here between these two countries, so it's not easy to send troops. Also, the U.S. Navy's waiting there. Colombia gives up Panama, and Panama signs a treaty giving the United States the right to build the Panama Canal. U.S. construction begins in 1906. Takes a long time. It's not done until Roosevelt's already out of office in 1914, and a lot of people died trying to build this canal. Over 22,000 French workers, over 5,000 American workers, and many other people from other parts of the country who were brought in to do the bulk of the labor. One of the reasons why the Americans were so much more successful at not losing people is because a doctor, Dr. Walter Reed, goes in there and discovers that it's mosquitoes breeding in stagnant water, which is causing a lot of the disease in the area. And he begins this drainage project to try to reduce the amount of mosquito breeding, which is causing a lot of disease. The canal is finally built, and it took a lot of hard work. Random side story. Talk about hard work. These little ants, these leaf cutter ants in Panama when I was walking around, these little buggers, man, they're just running. Look at that. They're all just going through the jungle, collecting leaf, sending it down underground into their little tunnel where they turn it into fungus or mold, and then they actually eat the mold, not the leaf. Cool stuff. Roosevelt's so excited about this idea of this canal, he becomes the first president ever, while serving as president, to leave the United States. He goes to Panama wearing a white suit at a construction site, probably not the brightest idea, to go witness the building of the Panama Canal. One of the early photos of a ship coming through it, a warship, and it's going to take a lot of work. Different locks, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all those different locks. Panama Canal, there it is. the ships coming through, these massive ships. These are the kind of the mules, the mechanical mules that help tow the ships through the canal to make sure they don't, bang into the concrete walls. Little tugboat, once again, not really to pull the boats, but to help steer them so they don't crash into the canal sides. Submarines aboard just in case there's a problem. A lot of wildlife near the canal, different types of wildlife. And like I said, ships from all over the world. This one from Germany. They're constantly doing jobs to the canal to make sure that it is functional. So digging out sediment from the bottom. These floating barges fill up this with soot and dirt and then drag it away. And here's some Panama porn, a little statue symbolizing the joining of these two oceans. The oceans, Pacific and the Atlantic. And when you go to Panama and Panama City, you'll see just tons of ships waiting their turn to go through the canal.
For your next video clip, you guys are going to be learning a little bit about the Russo-Japanese War of 1905 and the role of the United States, and specifically the role of Theodore Roosevelt in his quest to keep that balance of power within the region, and his efforts to negotiate some type of a deal to end the war between both Russia and Japan, which he's actually successful in doing. And he got a lot of praise for his role in ending this war, and actually is going to get the Nobel Peace Prize for doing so. Another thing that happens during the Roosevelt administration when it comes to Japan is that, kind of like China, you had a lot of Japanese workers coming to the United States, again, especially on the West Coast. And there was a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment, just like there was anti-Chinese sentiment. And the Japanese government began to protest pretty loudly to the American government to stop harassing and to stop segregating against the Japanese workers that were in the United States. And through a lot of talking with the American government, and agreement with Theodore Roosevelt, was basically what was known as the Gentleman's Agreement of 1907, which was a compromise between the Japanese and the United States, in that the Japanese promised to end Japanese immigration into the United States if the United States would stop discriminating, segregating Japanese people that were living in the United States. So it's called the Gentleman's Agreement. Some people viewed this as a sign of weakness with Theodore Roosevelt, because Roosevelt was someone who was more likely to stand up to other world powers, especially if he deemed them inferior, as he did with various cultures. But what's interesting about Roosevelt is that he actually admired the Japanese. And you guys need to understand, this is very important for what comes in the future with the world wars, is that Japan was an industrializing nation. Japan had colonies itself. Okay, so Theodore Roosevelt admired what the Japanese were doing, and it's going to be one of the reasons why that we agreed to the Gentleman's Agreement, but also that we are going to agree to the Japanese expanding into places like Manchuria and Korea, and the United States is pretty much going to turn a blind eye to that. The video will talk a little bit about these issues, but these are some of the things that you guys need to know. So enjoy this little video clip.
Events in far-off Asia had worried Theodore Roosevelt ever since his days as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Now Japan and Russia were fighting a bloody war there for control of the region.
Roosevelt thought Asia was very important to the United States. He thought that the United States was entering into what he called the Pacific century, and he believed that the United States had to dominate the Pacific in the 20th century.
Roosevelt feared that if either Russia or Japan overwhelmed the other, the balance of power in the region would be upset. By 1905, after a year of fighting, Japan was beating Russia badly.
Roosevelt watches this and understands that what is emerging here is a new Japan. A Japan is in the position essentially to dominate Asian politics. A Japan which was now becoming militarily paramount on the mainland of Asia, especially in Korea and South Manchuria. And there began to be a fear in the United States in 1905 that the next place that Japan might move might be the Philippines, where the United States, which the United States, of course, had taken in 1898. And as a consequence, Roosevelt believed that we had to come to terms with Japan.
Determined to stop the fighting and protect the Philippines, Roosevelt sent his good friend, Secretary of War William Howard Taft, to negotiate a secret deal with the Japanese Prime Minister. To conceal the real purpose of this sensitive mission, Roosevelt billed the trip as purely a goodwill tour and sent along his 21-year-old daughter by his first marriage, Alice. The eyes of the world focused on Alice as she was showered with gifts and attention. The Japanese were firmly convinced, the American ambassador wrote, that Alice was the Princess Royal of America. While the women bowed double again and again, Alice clutched my arm and exclaimed, "I love it, I love it." From her reception by the Emperor to her tour of his private gardens, the press reported every detail of Alice's triumph.
This is a bad mistake, because as they're following Alice around, Taft sits down with the Japanese Prime Minister, and secretly they work out a deal. And the deal is that the United States will recognize that Japan can take over Korea, and in return, it is understood that Japan will not touch the Philippines. It is so secret that Taft and Roosevelt keep it secret. It's not revealed for another 20 years. I think if they're ashamed of what they did to Korea, they essentially sold the Koreans out to the Japanese.
Roosevelt had placated the Japanese, but to restore order to the region, he still needed a full-fledged peace. That summer, he invited Russian and Japanese envoys to the United States. They met on the presidential yacht, anchored in the harbor near his home at Sagamore Hill. The Russians were weary of war. The Japanese were weary too, and now they knew that they were free to take Korea. But Roosevelt could still not be certain of a settlement. "I have led the horses to water," Roosevelt wrote a friend, "but heaven only knows whether they will drink or start kicking one another beside the trough." Officially, the president played no part in the negotiations, but he remained active behind the scenes, pushing and prodding the negotiators toward a settlement. "I'm having my hair turned gray," he wrote his son. "The Japanese ask too much, but the Russians are 10 times worse than the Japs because they are so stupid and won't tell the truth. What I really want to do," he confided to a friend, "is to give utterance to whoops of rage and jump up and knock their heads together. Well, all I can hope for is that self-repression will be ultimately good for my character." The future of Asia was at stake. The bickering and bargaining grew heated. But after 3 tense weeks, the delegates agreed to end the war.
The settlement was essentially fair, and it accomplished Roosevelt's purpose. It reestablished the balance of power in Asia, which is what he'd set about to do.
Although neither side was completely satisfied, Roosevelt was delighted. "This is splendid. This is magnificent," Roosevelt told a friend. "It's a mighty good thing for Russia, and a mighty good thing for Japan, and a mighty good thing for me, too." Congratulations poured in from around the world, and Theodore Roosevelt, who believed in the cleansing moral power of war and first won fame for leading the charge up San Juan Hill, was awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace.
For this next section, we're going to be focusing on what's known as the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, and then getting into Taft's foreign policy, which is known as dollar diplomacy. A corollary is in addition to something. So with the Roosevelt corollary, he's going to be adding something to the Monroe Doctrine. So if you remember, the Monroe Doctrine clearly states the European powers to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, that the United States is the overseer, protector of the Western Hemisphere. But when this was written in the 1820s, the United States really didn't have the ability to back this up in any means. So with Roosevelt into the presidency and building up our Navy in particular, now the United States has the ability to put it out there that we will use the military if necessary. And this fits into his big stick diplomacy, where he's saying, look, if you don't do what's in our best interest, as in the United States' best interest, then we can clobber you over the head and get what we want. And that would be using the Navy to do that. So this all really comes about as a result of some cases of some countries in Latin America who are defaulting on their loans that they owe to Britain and France in particular. So there's a fear that because these countries are defaulting on their loans, that it might cause Britain, for instance, to come back into the Americas, which would be a clear violation of the Monroe Doctrine. So Roosevelt's putting out there, don't do this, or we will end up using our military if necessary. We will brandish that big stick. This also goes into Taft's dollar diplomacy, because we'll find that one way we can assert our influence within Latin America is by using the economic power of the United States. So for instance, when it comes to these countries that are defaulting on their loans, what the United States is going to do is we're going to buy out those loans. So then that would prevent the European powers from trying to come back and maybe taking these colonies over or whatever. So again, dollar diplomacy, getting into this idea of using our economic power to assert our influence. And another thing is, because of the fact that we will actually then we will own the loans of various countries like Venezuela and the Dominican Republic, that we have that authority and influence over those countries now as well. So dollar diplomacy is a way to use our economic power to assert our political influence and our economic influence and just our influence in general. So the next video clip is going to talk about the Roosevelt corollary and then get into dollar diplomacy under the Taft administration.
The Roosevelt corollary and dollar diplomacy. Once the United States established a dominant presence in Panama, financial factors continued drawing the country deeper into Latin American affairs. During the late 1800s, many Latin American countries borrowed large sums of money from banks in Europe to develop industries and build railroads. When it became clear that many Latin American nations would be unable to repay these loans, President Theodore Roosevelt feared that European powers might begin to intervene in the Americas in order to collect these debts. Roosevelt was determined to make sure that that did not happen. Roosevelt made it clear to Europe that he intended to enforce the Monroe Doctrine. This 1823 declaration by President James Monroe had demanded that European countries stay out of the Americas. To clarify his stand on the issue, President Roosevelt borrowed from a West African proverb that stated, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." His enforcement of this policy became known as Big Stick Diplomacy. Using the Monroe Doctrine as a basis, Roosevelt issued his Roosevelt Corollary to Congress in 1904. He argued that unrest and disorder in Latin America could force the United States to exercise an international police power. Roosevelt described this style of foreign policy as taking decisive action sufficiently far in advance of any likely crisis. In other words, having and showcasing a powerful military could act as a deterrent, thus being a useful way to ensure peace in the Western Hemisphere. In a display of American military might, Roosevelt sent the U.S. Navy's Great White Fleet on a circumnavigation of the world in the final 2 years of his presidency. During the decade that followed the issuing of the Roosevelt Corollary, the policy was carried out on several occasions. William Howard Taft, Roosevelt's successor, arranged for American bankers to help the Central American nation of Nicaragua to repay their loans in 1911. In exchange, U.S. bankers gained control of Nicaragua's railroad and banking system. 2,000 U.S. Marines were also sent to Nicaragua to put down a revolt of the citizens who opposed their government's actions. American troops remained in Nicaragua until 1933. Citing Nicaragua as an example of success, the Taft administration would continue the policy of allowing the U.S. government to back up loans for American banks to nations in Latin America. The policy became known as dollar diplomacy, and it provided yet another effective way of keeping European powers out of Latin America and the Caribbean. The Roosevelt Corollary gave the United States a basis to use force to protect their economic interest anywhere in the Americas, while dollar diplomacy further tied the interest of the U.S. economy to its neighbors in the Western Hemisphere.
One of the things that's really interesting about William Howard Taft is that he actually has a lot of really good credentials when it comes to foreign policy. So for instance, he was the first Governor General of the Philippines. He was Secretary of War. He negotiated treaty with Japan. So you would think that he would have a really strong foreign policy. And while dollar diplomacy is a strong policy, it also created a lot of problems. He deferred his foreign policy essentially to his Secretary of State, a guy named Philander Knox. And so Knox is the guy who really concocts this whole idea of dollar diplomacy to promote our economic interests throughout the world and to use our economic power to achieve our goals. And we see this in many places throughout the world. Asia, for instance, we're going to try to buy out some railroads. In China, that ended up causing a lot of problems. And then Latin America, again, is the classic example when it comes to the, misuse of our foreign policy under the Taft administration. So what we're going to start to see are a lot of big businesses going into places like Honduras and Venezuela, and they're going to be establishing these businesses like the United Fruit Company, for instance, that are so powerful that these American businesses are controlling the entire country and basically promoting U.S. interests over that of the economic and political interest of the country in question. So, one of the things that I find fascinating is how many people throughout the world that have a negative viewpoint of the United States. And I don't think it's because they don't like us as a people. I think a lot of times it boils down to our foreign policy. So you got to think about, how does this make people feel in places like Nicaragua and Haiti and Venezuela? These places we're going in and we're basically just controlling them. How does it make these people feel? It's going to create a sense of resentment and animosity towards the United States. I mean, even to the point where we have to send our military into, say, Nicaragua, where we have to occupy these areas for many, many years because these people simply don't want to have the United States presence there. So I think looking at our foreign policy and understanding, today why so many people throughout the world have issues with the United States, again, looking at the past and looking at how we conducted our foreign policy, it's going to create those initial feelings of animosity towards the United States, which aren't going to go away really quickly. And this is one of the reasons why in the 1930s, for instance, when both President Hoover and Franklin Roosevelt, they're trying to ensure that these Latin American countries are friendly to our interests, so they begin to reverse some of these policies, because the fact of the matter is fascism spreading throughout the world, and we definitely don't want fascism coming to Latin America. So this next clip is going to be talking a little bit more about Taft and his dollar diplomacy.
Let's talk about President Taft and dollar diplomacy, what was known as dollar diplomacy. Taft brought some foreign policy credentials to the job of president. He had governed the Philippines, and as Secretary of War, he had negotiated several agreements, including the delicate Taft-Katsura Agreement of 1905. Yet he lacked TR's grasp of balance of power politics and his capacity for leadership. He therefore relied heavily on his Secretary of State, Philander K. Knox, who was a corporate lawyer. Knox's conduct of foreign policy seemed almost entirely focused on expanding opportunities for corporate investment overseas. His policies were often, therefore, described as dollar diplomacy. This was usually not a compliment. This was not entirely as morally bankrupt as it sounds. Taft and Knox believed that U.S. investments would substitute dollars for bullets, implying that diplomacy had become more commercial than the old balance of power model, i.e. they thought it was more moral to send dollars in to dominate rather than guns, but they were wrong about power not mattering as much. This failure to grasp the complexities of power politics would lead to some diplomatic reversals in East Asia, although some qualified successes in the Western Hemisphere. The examples we'll discuss are Manchuria, the Banana Republics, the Nicaraguan intervention, and to some degree Mexico. Now, Knox, prodded by his banker buddies, sought to expand U.S. economic activities throughout China, including Manchuria, northern province of China. Here you see it listed as Manchukuo. Eventually it would become totally taken over by the Japanese. This would be one of the acts of aggression leading to World War II. They would rename it the Japanese word Manchukuo. But anyway, Knox wanted to, expand U.S. economic activities in China, including Manchuria, and they clearly would encroach on the Japanese sphere of influence there. In 1911, Knox proposed that a group of American and European bankers buy the Japanese-controlled Southern Manchurian Railroad to open up North China to international trade. This involved a railroad promoter who envisioned a global rail link, which, by the way, has only recently become fulfilled. You can now travel by rail from London to Hong Kong. Ask me about that sometime. Japan reacted not well to this attempt by signing a friendship treaty with Russia, who was its recent enemy, which signaled their joint determination to exclude American, British, and French goods and economic dominance in Manchurian markets. Russia essentially controlled by now the north of Manchuria as a sphere of influence in Japan, the south. Knox's plan to buy the railroad collapsed, and the open-door policy suffered a serious blow. It wasn't equally open to all, clearly. Knox's further efforts to increase U.S. trade in central and southern China further angered Russia and Japan, and really played a part in contributing to the collapse of the Chinese government in 1912, in the revolution in which the Qing dynasty finally collapsed. Now, dollar diplomacy worked much better in Latin America, where no major power really contested U.S. dominance. Knox urged U.S. investment. That's the point of dollar diplomacy. U.S. companies, of which United Fruit of Boston is a prime example, established extensive produce plantations, primarily bananas, and railroad networks to support them in Costa Rica and Honduras, where United Fruit, particularly in those two countries, had a near monopoly and enough power to influence both the economies and the governments of those countries. When political turmoil or corruption would threaten their investments, the U.S. would simply send in the troops. There are too many instances of this to list. These are sometimes referred to as the banana wars, in these places as banana republics. This is where we get the term banana republic. Any perceived threat to the new canal could particularly set off American intervention. When Nicaraguan dictator Jose Santos Zelaya began negotiating in 1910 with European entities to build a second canal through Nicaragua, a competitor, a force of U.S. Marines toppled his regime. They couldn't have that. His successor, Adolfo Diaz, was essentially an American puppet. The U.S. persuaded American banks to loan him $1.5 million in exchange for control of the National Bank, the Customs Service, the fiscal tax collecting part of the government, and the railroads. In other words, the U.S. took over this country in all but name. When Nicaraguans, angered by the pro-American policies of Diaz, rose up against him in 1912, the U.S. invaded again to keep him in power. And except for a brief time in 1925, the troops remained continuously from 1912 until 1933. Under Taft, the U.S. continued to do whatever policymakers deemed necessary to bolster friendly governments and maintain order in Latin America. Now, most textbooks do not list Mexico as a supporting incident when describing the dollar diplomacy of Taft, but it bears mention. The U.S. had begun pouring money into Mexico, or had been pouring money into Mexico for decades, and controlled a large portion of the Mexican economy. The capitalist policies of longtime President Porfirio Diaz aided enormously in this effort, partly, though the causes are complex, as you'll learn, partly due to the resentment of American economic domination. A revolution broke out against Diaz in 1910 when Taft was president. Taft's ambassador to Mexico, Henry Lane Wilson, was a corporate lawyer and dollar diplomat, just like Knox, and actually helped engineer a counter-revolution to return to the dollar-friendly policies of Diaz. It was disastrous. Much more about that later.
And there you have it, the foreign policies of Roosevelt and Taft, big stick diplomacy and dollar diplomacy. So what I'd like you guys to do now is, when you're done with this, is to go up to the board, grab a marker, and I'd like you to jot down a couple, maybe a few takeaways that you've learned about foreign policy so far in this unit. So don't be bashful, get up there, get a pen, be appropriate. And that's it. So thanks for bearing with me and my beautiful voice. Bye.